Welcome back to the channel. In the early hours of a summer morning, a single act of aggression reshaped the destiny of millions. It was June 25, 1950, and a thick fog hung low over the hills and rice paddies of the Korean Peninsula. As the sun began to burn the mist away, the silence was shattered not by birdsong, but by the roar of artillery and the rumble of tanks. North Korean forces, armed and trained by the Soviet Union, had crossed the 38th parallel. This invisible line was never meant to be a permanent border. It was hastily drawn by two American colonels at the end of the Second World War, a temporary measure to separate the zones of occupation. The Soviet Union would oversee the disarmament of Japanese forces in the north, and the United States would do the same in the south. But a temporary line of convenience was rapidly solidifying into a hard border between two very different worlds. The North had become a rigid communist state under the iron rule of Kim Il-sung, a man with a grand vision of a unified Korea under his control. The South, though messy and democratic in name only, was backed by the West. The attack was not a border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion, a blitzkrieg powered by Soviet T-34 tanks that sliced through the lightly armed South Korean defenders. A sleeping world woke up to the news that a new war had erupted in the shadow of the atomic age. The fragile peace that had settled over the globe after the destruction of World War II was just 5 years old, and it was already coming undone. A conflict was beginning that would not be a simple victory parade. It was a war that would see desperate retreats, brilliant landings, and the terrifying prospect of a Third World War. This is the story of a forgotten conflict, a brutal struggle that is often overshadowed by the global wars that bookend it, yet its legacy burns intensely to this very day. This is the Korean War. We continue with the story of a mission that was doomed before it began. With the North Korean army steamrolling south, the American military command in Japan scrambled to put a foot on the ground. The call fell upon the 24th Infantry Division, stationed in Japan as an occupation force. They were not a war-ready unit. These were young men who had grown soft on garrison duty, living with their families, their equipment rusty from peace. Their commander, General William F. Dean, was ordered to send a small delaying force to Korea immediately. The order was to throw a speed bump in front of the speeding North Korean tank columns. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith, a veteran of the Pacific War. The unit would become tragically known as Task Force Smith. On a rainy, gloomy morning, this force of a little over 400 men boarded planes and landed in a country none of them knew, to fight an enemy they did not understand. They were cocky, calling it a police action, and they carried the arrogance of a nation that had never lost a war. They moved north, digging into shallow, muddy foxholes on a ridge overlooking the main highway near a village called Ozen. They had bazookas that were left over from World War II, and almost no armor. When the North Korean tanks appeared on the horizon, the Americans opened fire. The nightmare began. The bazooka rockets bounced harmlessly off the thick armor of the T-34s, like pebbles thrown at a steel door. The tanks didn't even slow down. They simply rolled over the defensive line, machine guns blazing, crushing the morale of the young soldiers. Task Force Smith held for hours, running out of ammunition, suffering horrific casualties. When the order to retreat finally came, it was chaos. Exhausted and terrified men abandoned their heavy weapons and fled into the hills, trying to survive. The first battle between North Korea and the United States was a catastrophic defeat, a blunt and horrifying lesson that this was not a police action. It was a real war, and the enemy was not just determined, but devastatingly effective. We continue with a desperate struggle for survival. After the disaster at Ozen, the entire American and South Korean force was pushed back, step by bloody step, down the peninsula. The situation was a military catastrophe. Soldiers were retreating so fast they called it the bug-out fever. The roads were clogged with terrified refugees and shattered units. The proud American army was being driven into the sea. The combined forces were crammed into a tiny, jagged rectangle in the very southeastern corner of Korea. This was the Pusan perimeter, a box roughly 100 miles wide and 50 miles deep, named after the vital port city at its heart. To lose Pusan was to lose the war. There was no more room to retreat. Behind them lay only the cold waters of the Sea of Japan. The commander on the ground, General Walton Walker, a tough bulldog of a man who had served under General Patton, issued the orders that would define his career. He stood before his exhausted officers and told them this was a stand-or-die situation. There would be no more pulling back. They had to hold the line, not for tactical reasons, but for the very survival of the army. If they were pushed out, the war was over. The defense of the Pusan perimeter was a close-quarters nightmare, a brutal struggle fought in the sweltering, breathless heat of the Korean summer. The North Korean army threw everything they had at the perimeter in a series of human wave attacks. They wanted a knockout blow before the Americans could build up their strength. The fighting was chaotic and savage, hand-to-hand combat over rocky ridgelines and burning villages. Ammunition ran low, men survived on little water, and the line bowed inward dangerously. But it did not break. Every North Korean assault was met with a wall of artillery and small arms fire. The terrain that had trapped the defenders now became a cage for the attackers, forcing them into narrow kill zones. The soldiers defending Pusan came to be known as the Fire Brigade, rushing from one crisis point to another to plug the gaps. The perimeter held, but just barely, and it bought the single most precious commodity in war, time. Now, we arrive at a moment of pure, audacious genius. While the weary soldiers held the line at Pusan by their fingernails, a five-star general was planning one of the most daring amphibious operations in military history. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the United Nations forces, watched the map with a cold, strategic eye. To him, the brutal defense of Pusan was not just a last stand. It was an anvil. He intended to swing a hammer of unimaginable force far behind the enemy lines. He chose a place called Incheon, a port city on the west coast of Korea, very close to the capital, Seoul. Every textbook on amphibious warfare declared that a landing at Incheon was tactical madness. The harbor had one of the highest tidal fluctuations in the world, a daily rise and fall of over 30 feet. At low tide, the water rushed out for miles, leaving behind vast, sticky mudflats that would trap any landing craft, making them sitting ducks. The approach channels were narrow, winding, and could be easily blocked by a single sunken ship. A military assault depended on precise timing and surprise, and nature itself seemed to be the enemy at Incheon. MacArthur's own staff argued against it, their faces tight with anxiety, calling the plan a 20,000 to 1 gamble. But MacArthur saw what others did not. He argued that the very impossibility of the landing was its greatest strength. The enemy would never expect it. In a dramatic briefing, the old general, with his corncob pipe, spoke of a masterstroke that would sever the enemy's supply lines and trap the North Korean army between his Marines landing at Incheon and the 8th Army breaking out of Pusan. On September 15, 1950, the gamble was executed. The tides came in, and the United States Marines stormed ashore on a beach called Woolmi Island. The North Korean defenders, caught completely by surprise, were overwhelmed. The impossible had happened. The hammer had struck, and it was devastating. With the Marines now ashore at Incheon, the entire strategic picture of the war changed in an instant. The North Korean army, which had been relentlessly hammering the Pusan perimeter, suddenly realized they were trapped. Their supply line, the long, thin thread stretching back through Seoul, had been cut. General Walker, watching from his headquarters, gave the order his men had been waiting to hear. The Eighth Army was to break out of the Pusan perimeter and drive north to link up with the Marines. The force that had been holding on for survival now went on the attack, and the transformation was immediate. They smashed through the demoralized and exhausted North Korean forces. The link-up between the forces in the south and the Marines from Incheon was a chaotic, joyful affair, but the job was not finished. Seoul, the capital, had to be recaptured. The fight for the city was a brutal street-by-street nightmare. MacArthur was a man in a hurry. He did not just want to restore the old border at the 38th parallel, he now had a grander vision. The goal had shifted from repelling the invasion to completely destroying the North Korean army and unifying the country under a single, non-communist government. The United States, with the endorsement of the United Nations, gave him the authority to cross the parallel and push north. The armies rolled forward, past the old dividing line, chasing a broken enemy that was melting into the hills. The soldiers, buoyed by the incredible success of the Incheon landing, began to talk about being home by Christmas. The air turned crisp and cold as they marched past a landscape of bombed-out villages. They were heading for a river that marked the border between North Korea and a vast, mysterious nation that had been watching the entire campaign with growing alarm. That river was the Yalu, and on its far bank sat the unknown. The soldiers marched towards the north, unaware that the war was about to take a terrifying and monstrous turn. As the United Nations forces raced towards the Yalu River, a giant was stirring across the border. In Beijing, the leaders of the newly communist China watched the advance with deep and growing fear. A unified, American-allied Korea on their industrial border in Manchuria was an unthinkable strategic threat. Through back channels, they warned the United States not to cross the 38th parallel. The warnings were dismissed as communist bluff. American intelligence saw no signs of a massive intervention. But they were wrong. During the frozen nights of October, a ghost army was crossing the Yalu River. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, calling themselves the People's Volunteers Army, moved under the cover of darkness. They were masters of camouflage, hiding in caves and forests during the day, moving so silently and with such discipline that they were invisible to low-flying reconnaissance planes. The American forces continued their advance, growing overconfident, their units stretched thin on roads separated by massive, rocky peaks. They were walking directly into a colossal trap. The Chinese Spring was a phenomenon of pure shock and terror. It began with the sudden, piercing sound of bugles and whistles echoing through the mountain passes. Then, waves of Chinese soldiers, wearing quilted winter uniforms that blended into the barren landscape, surged forward. They attacked with astonishing fury, rolling down the hillsides in human waves, blowing their horns and firing. The first major collision happened at a place called Unsan, where a South Korean regiment was annihilated, and an American battalion was surrounded and destroyed. The shock was absolute. This was not a minor border incursion. It was a massive, well-led, and utterly unexpected new war. The myth of being home by Christmas evaporated in a blizzard of gunfire and frozen blood. The soldiers who thought they were at the finish line realized they were suddenly fighting for their very existence against an enemy that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The war had been completely and irreversibly transformed. We arrive at the most legendary and savage battle of the Korean War. High in the mountains of North Korea, a force of United States Marines and a handful of Army soldiers found themselves trapped in a frozen nightmare. Their objective was the chosen reservoir, a man-made lake surrounded by jagged, treeless peaks, where temperatures can drop to the most extreme levels on the planet. When the Chinese wave crashed down, 15,000 American troops were isolated, surrounded by a force of over 100,000 Chinese soldiers. The battle that followed was not a contest for territory. It was a fight for survival in an environment that felt like another planet. The cold was a third combatant, brutal and indiscriminate. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero, turning rifle bolts to solid metal and freezing plasma in medical tents. Marines had to pour gasoline over their weapons to thaw them enough to fire. But even in this frozen hell, surrounded and outnumbered 10-1, the Marine commander, General Oliver P. Smith, gave the battle its immortal character. When reporters asked him about his retreat, he corrected them coldly. He was not retreating. He was simply attacking in a different direction. The march to the sea from Chosin was a fighting withdrawal through frozen gorges and over narrow mountain passes. They had to fight for every mile, carrying their wounded on stretchers made of rifle stocks, never abandoning their dead. The engineers dropped bridges that had been destroyed, and the fighter pilots flew so low they could see the faces of the enemy, dropping napalm to keep the human waves at bay. The column of men and vehicles pushed forward through a gauntlet of fire, their feet black with frostbite, their faces covered in frozen masks of snow and dirt. When they finally reached the port of Hungnam, they had not been annihilated. They had brought out their dead and their vehicles. The fighting withdrawal from Chosin Reservoir was an act of sheer, indomitable will that became the defining mythology of the United States Marine Corps, a story of tragedy and glory carved into an icy mountain. With the heroic but terrible escape from the north, the wild swings of the war came to a sudden stop. General Matthew Ridgway, a leader made of steel wire and sheer grit, took command of the shattered 8th Army after General Walker was killed in a jeep accident. Ridgway found an army with its spirit broken, looking over its shoulder for the next Chinese horde. He turned them around. He restored their fighting heart and put them back on the offensive, slowly and brutally pushing the Chinese back across the 38th parallel. By the spring of 1951, the front line had stabilized roughly where everything had started. The war of movement was over. The mobile war gave way to a static slugfest that looked disturbingly like the First World War. The landscape of Central Korea was transformed into a moonscape of interlocking trenches, bunkers carved deep into hillsides, sandbag forts, and barbed wire winding across the mountains. The war became a cynical chess game for hilltops with names that mean nothing on a map but became graveyards for thousands. Battles were fought over ridges with names like Pork Chop Hill, Old Baldy, and Heartbreak Ridge. A hill would be captured in a savage human wave assault, only to be shelled into bloody mud and lost the next day. The numbers were grotesque. To gain a few meters of torn earth, artillery barrages would leave the peaks completely denuded of life, the soil turned to fine dust. This was while truce talks had already begun. The negotiations started at a place called Kaesong, then moved to Panmunjom, a simple collection of huts built in the no-man's land between the two armies. There, the weirdest spectacle of the war unfolded, where delegates sat across a table and argued for years while men continued to die in the trenches. The war had become a paradox of diplomacy and violence, a stalemate of position and politics where the only certain outcome was pain. As the ground war ground into a stalemate of trenches, the most emotional battle of the Korean War took place not on a hilltop, but in the prison camps. This was a war of ideology, and the fight for the human soul became the final, unexpected obstacle to peace. The primary issue at the truce talks was no longer the borderline, it was the fate of prisoners of war. The United Nations Command, adhering to the principle of individual freedom, refused to forcibly repatriate prisoners who did not want to return to a communist life. This position, called voluntary repatriation, was a direct attack on communist pride. The Chinese and North Koreans were furious. They demanded every prisoner be sent back, as a forced repatriation would prove that no one would willingly abandon their system. The UN prisoner camps on an island called Kojdu became a powder keg of political war. Within these camps, the communists established a shadow government. They held courts, enforced discipline, and used terror and murder to maintain control over the anti-communist majority. The situation erupted into a violent crisis. The camp commander, a general, was lured to a gate and then captured by the prisoners in a humiliating ambush. It was a stunning propaganda victory for the communists and a deep embarrassment for the American military. The new commander, General Boatner, was sent in with a mandate to clean house. He used overwhelming force, storming the compounds with tanks and tear gas in chaotic and bloody operations to separate the prisoners and break the communist control. While the guns remained mostly silent on the front lines, the fight in the camps was raw and personal. The war had distilled itself down to its most basic element, the right of a man to choose his own fate. The negotiations at Panmunjom were deadlocked over this single, powerful word, repatriation. And as the diplomats argued, the families at home waited, wondering if their sons were still alive in a frozen country far away. We end this story at the negotiating table in a place called Panmunjom. After 2 years of bitter talks and hundreds of thousands of casualties while waiting, a final agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. It was not a victory. It was a simple armistice, a ceasefire designed to stop the killing until a permanent peace treaty could be figured out. That peace treaty has never been signed. The Korean War ended exactly where it had started 3 years and 1 month earlier, roughly along the 38th parallel. A new border was drawn, not by colonels this time, but by the topography of war itself. It was called the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, a 2.5-mile wide strip of no man's land that cuts across the peninsula at the exact line of contact. It is a silent, eerie monument to a frozen conflict. On one side, a heavily fortified, armed, and tense peace, watched by North Korean soldiers standing rigidly in perfect stone-faced poses. On the other, South Korean soldiers in mirrored sunglasses, standing in a disciplined taekwondo stance, a silent psychological war of postures. The cost of the war was catastrophic. Millions of Korean civilians and soldiers were dead. The nation was left a shattered, ash-covered ruin. And the geopolitical scars still define our world. South Korea took that ruined land and, through a miracle of human endeavor, built an economic titan, a vibrant democracy of global culture and technological power. The North became a hermit kingdom, a dynastic dictatorship that has spent decades building nuclear weapons, its people living under a brutal cult of personality and often in great poverty. The guns fell silent in 1953, but the war never truly ended. It remains an open wound, a last vestige of a hot Cold War. The men who fought there are now in their twilight years, and the conflict has faded from the public memory, earning its title as the Forgotten War. But its legacy is the very shape of our modern world. It was a brutal, savage, and necessary reminder that in the nuclear age, war did not disappear. It just got colder, and infinitely more complicated. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a conflict that should never be forgotten. If you want to learn more about the hidden corners of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. See you in the next one.